Thanks for the invitation to be here today. It's a real honour, and thanks to all the previous presenters. It's been very interesting to see that we're all struggling and getting on with the same things, I think. Over the course of the next 30-40 minutes, Brendan and I need to get a flight out of here, so we're going to be keeping tight, pretty strict along the way here. We're going to introduce you today to an ESG topic. You'll be familiar with the content, I think, to a large extent, but we want to introduce you a data science approach to how we identify, analyze, and then ultimately supervise the information that we have. As we go through it today, we're going to give you a little bit of background as to how we arrived with the great work that Brendan has done. I should mention, by the way, that I'm responsible for the market supervision division within the Central Bank of Ireland. In my role, we supervise the market abuse, market surveillance, market supervision, but we also provide data analytics to the broader directorate, which includes asset management, primary markets as well as secondary markets. So we have quite a broad mandate. We do quite a lot of things. And back in 2022, we started with SFTR rolling out and various other pieces of taxonomies. We started to look a little more closely at what might we do around greenwashing, for example. So Brendan and the team, Brendan is part of our risk analytics team, and he will give you the majority of the presentation today because it's his great work that has got us into the place that we're in today. But back in 2022, we figured out that we wanted to start looking a bit more closely at greenwashing and what might we do about that and how might we use the first elements of data analytics in order to get there. So we did a thematic. We came out with some useful content. And then in 2023, what we did was we introduced a new way of prioritizing the data initiatives that we have within our directorate. So what does that mean? What does that look like? Well, what it means is that we've created a data portfolio for our initiatives. And that data portfolio is one where we add new elements based off business value according to a process that we've introduced. And what that ultimately meant was that in Q2 of this year, Brendan pitched the idea that we would do some deeper diving into ESG and all the things that we needed to figure out in order to be able to supervise ESG more effectively. And what we're about to show you today is the output from that pitch and from that work. So just to set the context and set the scene a little bit first, what are we assessing when we speak about ESG? So we have a large fund management industry in Ireland. We have many, many thousands of prospectuses, many, many hundreds of mancos, and we try and make sure that we spend our time efficiently, and we wanted to be in a position to dig deeper into ESG. So ESG, at the highest of levels, is speaking about, from an environmental point of view, carbon, water, use of renewables. On the social side, it looks at human rights, fair trade, responsible employment practices, and on the governance side, it looks around things like transparency, policies, procedures, and ethical business practices. When you get into trying to do supervision on such a complex space, you are also then met with certain classifications. So, for example, under SFDR, we have Article 6, Article 8, and Article 9 funds. Article 6 funds are a little bit of everything. They're not really pretending or proposing to be ESG compliant, even though actually, when you look through the detail, we find that probably some of them would be and should be classified, or could be at least classified, as Article 8. But definitely Article 8 makes up the majority. So Article 8 funds are those funds that promote environmental or social characteristics, but don't really have very specific objectives set out in their formal documentation. And while Article 9 do, they're the eco-waters of this world, or the carbon-driven portfolios, which specifically say they will invest in carbon-reducing elements, for example. So what am I saying here ultimately is that the classification is quite complex. There's quite a broad scope of things in play. And then when you look at the UN Global Compact piece, these are further muddying the water. They're setting some very clear standards. Some of the stuff that's in here is required, again, under the PAIs, as they're called, the Principal Adverse Impacts. So some of the Article 9 funds will actually report on this stuff. The picture here, as you can see, there's 10 elements here. these are disclosures that will be found in certain portfolios as well. And when you come to supervise this stuff, what I'm trying to paint a picture of here is that it's quite complex. Furthermore, the data that you will use behind the scenes here is often from third parties, so that makes it even more complex. And then when we began our journey thinking about what will we do in order to supervise this, we were struck by a survey like this one, which ultimately says that when I am about to invest in a portfolio as an institutional or retail investor, what I might just do is look at the label. I might not look under the hood of what's in the fund at all. So we were struck by this. We felt if this is 50-50, which is ultimately what you're seeing here, that people are more just looking at the label, or at least 50% of the time they're just looking at the label, rather than actually the underlying investments of the funds, then it becomes quite apparent that this is extremely important, or that it's extremely important that the fund is doing what it says it does. And that's a little bit where we began our journey. Finally, before I pass over to Brendan, just to give you a sense of the scale of ESG funds in our jurisdiction. So you can see here on the green bars that there's been a significant increase in ESG, and you'll notice a substantial jump there at the beginning of the year. That was to do with Q&As and classifications around templates. So we see this happening, Article 6 funds suddenly becoming also Article 8. And that makes it complex. And you'll see too, Article 6, obviously, quite a substantial number of funds in our space. So the scene, the context, it's complicated. As supervisors, what do? We lean into artificial intelligence and machine learning.
Hello everyone. So my name is Brendan Stebbing. I'm largely responsible for the development of the analytical process being used here. This of course took in a lot of feedback throughout the CBI. There's engagement with enforcement, fund supervision, many analytics teams and data providers, data focused teams on how we source this information. As Gavin outlined there, we're dealing with quite a wide remit when we deal with greenwashing, and especially in the function of SFDR. In a lot of cases, what SFDR represents is driven by industry participants, meaning that there is an explicit need to really engage in text-based analysis to identify what kind of assessments you would need to do to investigate greenwashing in a specific fund. As a result of that, much of this process is going to be NLP-based. It's going to be a mixture, which I'll go through in a couple of slides. But to begin with, I'm going to quite openly speak about some of the challenges involved in attempting to develop a process around greenwashing, especially on the kind of scale that we're talking about and on the kind of approach to getting as much completeness as we can here, in that we really are trying to assess any claim made in relation to ESG. So to kick things off, I'll just mention that when it comes to ESG, we are in an evolving landscape. What I mean by that is, while we are ultimately seeking to address greenwashing immediately, we are in a framework where the data involved with that and data availability and quality and how widely reported is something that's still evolving. We do also see changes from a regulatory perspective year on year. Some examples of this that affect how we would approach greenwashing in funds, for example, this year would be, we have specific mention of, say, Q&As that were released by the EU Commission earlier this year. And Gavin alluded to this, but for example, following that, we saw some 80 billion in reclassifications from Article 6, Article 8 upwards. The result of this meaning that the funds that we're assessing and where these things lie is in an evolving space. We have funds that maybe are not sure where they sit, or maybe are on the verge of breaking into Article 8, Article 9, but are looking for some clarification, some change in guidelines for them to make that jump. We would have mentioned previously, you saw the UN Global Compact exists as a separate set of external guidelines. So this exists separate to SFDR, but it is referenced. It is directly involved as a mandatory PAI. And there are other sets of international guidelines. You'll see in charts in a couple of slides that, for example, bodies that are launched by the FSB, such as the Task Force on Climate Financial Disclosures, that set out some guidances or some guidances on calculations for metrics involved in ESG. These all exist. These all coexist together, and depending on the language used in documentation, depending on the scale of the investment, you're looking to assess all of these different claims and all of these different sources. So, as Gavin mentioned, this process for us began quite a while ago. We started investigating this back in 2022, and I've mentioned that SFDR as a whole is in many cases driven by industry participants, so financial products or the administrators of these financial products themselves. And what we found early on is that when it comes to industry representation of ESG, a lot of the time the sources for this information amount to the reporting of risk metrics, such as ESG scoring, ESG risk ratings. These are available from a number of third parties. We see even now, for example, that when we assess the universe of funds at our disposal, we see a number of them report these ratings such as these as being explicit drivers of the investment strategy, meaning that when they're outlining the strategy as to how the fund is aligned with Article 8 or aligned with Article 9, it is due to investing in products that meet certain requirements within these third-party scores. So the issue that we come to quite quickly is that these scores are very inconsistent when you're looking at different providers. As a result of that, the securities that are being targeted, the securities that these fund managers, for example, are being directed to by these scores, it varies greatly by which provider they choose. This was also explicitly called out this year in a consultation paper with the EU Commission, where there is a proposal to instigate regulation around these ratings. At the moment, these ratings themselves, there's no regulation surrounding transparency, or really the integrity of them, the relationships between the companies issuing these ratings and the securities that they're giving ratings to. So this is an area of risk for us. It's something that we have some evidence that on a large scale it is affecting the weightings of different securities and portfolios if we're comparing ESG funds to non-ESG. And even beyond that, we see direct evidence in documentation that in many cases it is a key driver of investment decisions. I'm now going to start to move towards the NLP space, which will form quite a lot of this presentation. But as we're on the topic of challenges, I'll just outline that ESG as a whole, when you're speaking about large language models, or when you're speaking about modeling in general relating to ESG terms, it's an extraordinarily wide topic. Gavin would have mentioned earlier that in simple terms, you're looking across environmental, social, and governance. But if you were to look at third-party data providers, if you were to look at what kind of data do I need to source to be able to assess any ESG claim you might come across, you're going to quite quickly ramp up to over 600 individual data fields, individual measurements, different things that are in some ways related to ESG, any of the elements involved. And that extends to language as well. When we look to model the language of ESG, when we look at the documentation related to Article 8 funds, Article 9 funds, in comparison to Article 6's, when you look to gather all of that information and assess all of the ways that these funds are interpreting SFDR, the differing definitions for what sustainable investment means to that firm, you quickly balloon into thousands of terms. So from our analysis of these sources and from looking at different research sources that has gone on the ESG space, we're by now well over the point of having 1,600 plus terms that we associate with ESG in a general sense, in terms of identifying what text is related to an ESG claim or could be relevant for our purposes in investigating greenwashing. Further to that, I'll just quickly mention that because we're dealing with a very, in a sense, live language here, the way that the terminology works is very wide-reaching and varies quite significantly. So when you have a key term, something simple even like climate change, it's not really the case that you can just search for climate change. Even if you were to use typical text analysis processes and just look for matches, it won't work because you're going to have terminology such as a fund having investments with the goal to mitigate our changing environment. And the word change is going to match there, and climate isn't where it should be. So for that purpose, we use a lot of stemming techniques. We use a lot of techniques that generalize these terms, and these are applied across every term. So we can match or we can attempt to match every form that these words can take, which is, in a sense, very language focused. But it's necessary for ESG because this isn't a case where we have some Q&A where the question is a preset in wording. There are cases like that, but there are also cases where it's free-form text in documentation. So beyond that complexity, which deals with the documentation side, of course, if you're investigating greenwashing, you also need to assess a portfolio level assessment to see if the claims being made in text align with calculations related to the fund or related to the portfolio. And a very specific challenge that arises with ESG is that typically when you're investigating a claim made by a fund, or you have some concern and you want to investigate whether it's true, you're performing some calculation on the portfolio as it stands. When we're talking about ESG and when we're assessing greenwashing, very often these calculations extend well into the future. There is an element of needing to assess how the portfolio stands now, but also how the portfolio of securities reports it will be in the future. And this is a continuous process. This is something where the companies involved can report where they will be at 2050, 2030, and so on, as being the guidance for how these are aligned with, say, international guidelines such as the Paris Alignment Agreement, and so on. As a result of this, when we're dealing with emission data, which environmental data is probably the most widely available source, or the most widely available and most referenced information, it's still a question that the figures that would represent these broad targets, these net zeros, these Paris Alignment Agreements, these differ year on year, and there's something that change over time as to what represents that at that point in time. And so, as a result, when we're dealing with portfolio calculations here, there's a need to identify language related to present, the future, and to be able to tie down when we need to look at these calculations, how we assess them wholesale. So, I'll now speak to the analytical process, which primarily will deal with the text analysis side, because that is, in terms of development time, it is a significant portion of the process as a whole. So, to begin with, just to give a broad outline, this is a three-part process. This is, on the one hand, we have a large-scale assessment of documentation. We have access to hundreds of thousands of documents, very literally, which need to be sourced. They need to be essentially searched for relevant information tied to the funds that they're related to. And we also need to identify what kind of documentation it is, whether it's a key investor document, whether it's a prospectus, an annex, a supplement, marketing material. All of this information needs to be gathered up, needs to be identified, indexed as far as when was this data received, when is it relevant as of, in the event that funds change classification and such. And fundamentally, there's a need to take this unstructured data and convert it into some format where we can do a large-scale assessment across our entire universe. With that in mind, contrary to that, we have a portfolio analysis piece, which is where, upon sourcing all this information from documentation, we look at what is the portfolio itself doing. This involves very literally hundreds of key data points, assessments both present, future, in some cases the past, if the claim is relating to a change year on year. And we also need to keep in mind any offsetting methodologies, for example, investments in carbon credits, if things like that are mentioned in the documentation. So finally, the ultimate goal here is to have a high-level, interpretable, very transparent assessment of greenwashing, meaning that we can tie down what claims are being made, what data is relevant to these claims, and whether the data fits the claim being made. So this extends essentially in two directions. This in many ways is a consumer protection focused piece, in that this is in many ways marketing directly to investors, and so there is a need for it to be correct. But there's also regulatory guidelines to keep in mind. There are broad characteristics of funds that we want to make sure are maintained, and especially because we're in a climate where in many cases these funds or this classification regime is being interpreted as a broad green label. We need to make sure that these documents are or that these products, I should say, are appropriate. So, quite quickly, this is actually a real-life example, anonymized, of a document that's been transformed into a database format. I mentioned that a key goal here is the ability to take all this unstructured information and convert it into one standardized format, maintaining as much of the information as possible from it. So in the bottom left, we have an example of a document in Microsoft Word, and in the bottom right, we have that same document converted into a database table, or entries in a table, I should say. You'll notice that we store a lot of information separate to what the document is saying, which would be in the text field. For example, we store an index value, meaning that we can say in what order information occurs, because in many cases, when you're entering the world of machine learning, you need to maintain as much of this meta information as possible, because the relationships that these texts can have to each other is dependent on where they are in the document. Something being before or after something can change the meaning of sentences or the meaning of statements being made. Further to that, we also took the step to absorb not only text data, but table information, which it is text data also in some cases, but it does require us to maintain where this sits in a table. So we can identify this information is in a table, what row is it, what column is it, which is very important for understanding the context of that information. In many cases, when you're assessing tables, a simple assessment would be to investigate what kind of formatting the information is in, whether it's text, whether it's numbers, and if that's occurring on a column basis or a row basis, that tells you that very likely you've got a series of values and a series of queries, or a series of data points, essentially, which can then be extracted for assessment. So, with that in mind, we apply the processes that I pointed to earlier when I was speaking about the language of ESG, and we can extract specific tokens from these corpuses of text that we have stored as a database. To give an idea of the scale here, on the left, that ID document is a single document, so this is number 130,096, and that one document contains 6 specific claims being made. So the goal there is to use that terminology, to use the kind of words being used, the kind of language being used to assess what kind of information is this referring to. In these cases, we're looking at peer emissions, but more specifically, we're looking at a comparison to the broader market. So in this fund's case, rather than reporting some absolute value or some target amount of emissions in tons, it's an aim to be better than average. It's an aim to be better than similar peers. Likewise, underneath that, you're seeing an example where the goal is to reduce year on year. You're also seeing examples of where the green revenue should be greater than the broader market. So again, that's a comparison to peers. But in this case, it's quite specific. When we're dealing with green revenue, what that means is in general investments, you're looking at the proportion of green bonds, products that are labeled as sustainable. But in some cases, if you're dealing with, say, an energy producing company, what that would refer to is the proportion of that energy generation that comes from renewable sources. And so depending on the type of the fund, the meaning changes slightly, but we know what we're looking for from the kind of language used. Finally, you're seeing a lot of examples of exclusion principles. So these are things that are very frequently seen. They're near universal in that funds will outline lists of entities or lists of sectors that they will not invest in. This is in part involved in the SFDR regulation also. So there is very often going to be some element of this mentioned. And so the check there is simple. Is it an exclusion principle? In which case they should not hold these things. Below that, I'll give an example of a sort of positive. So this is an Article 8 fund here, and you may have seen previously in the slide detailing Article 6 versus 8 versus 9 that the objectives of Article 8 funds are more indirect than Article 9 in that their objective is to promote sustainable objectives. That can mean many things depending on the interpretation of that firm. And in this case, we can see how they've interpreted how they're going to meet that requirement, is that they're going to invest in renewable energy, they're going to invest in forestry, in which case we can identify that in an automated fashion, and we can confirm that they are invested in those sectors. So, from the language, we can see blocks of text, we can see tokens that are related to ESG. We can also see what kind of data are they speaking about. But again, we're dealing with thousands of documents. We're dealing with thousands of funds. Our database at the moment contains some 15,000 documents that all contain this kind of information. So for humans to work through this information and to interpret it would take a lot of time. Even simple claims like a fund wanting to be greater than, wanting to invest in securities that have more than some amount, some measure, or less, require human eyes. But we've developed an approach to try and remove as much of this work as possible, and that's done through sentiment analysis. So on the one hand, we do have key terms, we do have ESG terminology that tells us what are they talking about, what kind of information. But further to that, the language in terms of positivity, negativity will often drive what their actual objective is in relation to this measure. So whether they want to invest in it, they are avoiding investing in it, or in some more complicated examples where you'll have a mixture. For example, the third case there, you'll see a sentence that states that they will not invest in something, but it's conditional on some measure being above a value. So these are all kind of language that you can piece together from this kind of assessment. We're quite upfront about this because we ultimately have supervisory goals here. So there is a need for these processes to be transparent, for there to be adequate understanding and ability to read through how we come to conclusions at the end of this process. I keep changing my laptop slide instead of the actual. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to speak through how we use, or some examples of how we can use these processes to identify funds. In that, as a result of this, we have gathered a tremendous amount of data related to ESG. We can see how these funds fit on these curves. Say if we look at various particular measures, we can see how they compare to others between Article 6s, Article 8s, Article 9s. So, as an example of that, what you're looking at here is WASI. So this is an emission data point, but it's a little specific in that when you're dealing with emissions, there are a number of different calculation methodologies. This here is the degree of emissions in a fund, but scaled by the revenue of the security. So when a fund invests in a security, if you were to look at absolute emissions, you could have some mining company that is particularly bad for the environment, but it's a relatively small company. And then on the other hand, you may have Google, which all in all are a tech stock, are probably not as concentrated as a mining company when it comes to emissions, but the sheer scale of the company will drive the emission profile to where if you look at an absolute basis, you'll be identifying large companies rather than companies that are particularly intensive in their operations. So we source this information for every security in every fund in every time period. We then weight these figures up to give an overall value for the fund. And so that's what you're seeing here, is that across all our Article 6 funds, Article 8 funds, Article 9 funds, you're seeing what their WASI reports to be as of September this year. We'll also note that the source we use for, that I mentioned in the future-focused emission slide, the primary source for our targets here over time are through the TCFD, which is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which has since merged into the ISSB. But that outlines really, in terms of all these individual metrics, what these figures should be at different points in time to be aligned with particular objectives. So in our case, if we want to look at alignment with net zero, we can see that that's represented by, at the moment, a WASI score of about 110 and below. In which case, we can see that actually, across Article 6s, 8s, and 9s, from the zoomed in slide in the bottom right, you would say that a majority of these funds are actually within this level. But we do have outliers. The question is, since SFDR does not explicitly set, say, thresholds on what amount of emission is sustainable or not, the question then becomes, what are these funds stating? If we were to look at these outliers and see that some of them are stating to be net zero or aligned with the Paris Alignment Agreement and so on, this would immediately pose problems to us. So as some examples of fund assessments, we'll show two anonymized funds that are essentially present in the outliers within this slide. Do it again. Okay, so here's one. The example of this fund really is to set out the kind of wording that you can come across, the kind of loose terminology that can be used in this documentation. So this is a carbon transition fund by name. When we look at its emission profile, we see that at the moment it's at about 10 times what you'd associate with net zero. The portfolio analysis reveals that it holds investments in crude oil, and more than that, it holds investments in firms that, when compared to peers, are well over 2 times what would be average for their group. So even among energy-producing companies, which would include, say, companies that produce energy through burning oil and so on, these are still bad even in comparison to that. when we look at the investment objective of the fund to see if this is all right with what they're saying, essentially, if these two are mirrored, or if these two are married appropriately, we see that the approach that this fund takes is it applies a scoring methodology where it applies a score to each of the securities within the fund, which assesses a carbon transition score. So how much do they think it aligns with an objective of carbon transitioning? But as we've underlined in red down there, the end result of this is that this score only serves to make it more likely that they'll invest in it. So they don't necessarily rule out the fact that they may invest in securities that are particularly bad emission profiles. So the question there is this language appropriate? Is it reasonable that an investor could read this and think this fund doesn't invest in securities that have a poor profile from a transition perspective, especially in that the fund has the stated goal of carbon transitioning? The second example is a little more direct. So it looks similar. Again, it's about 10 times what we'd associate with net zero. This one has the stated goal of being a clean infrastructure fund. And they set out the meaning of that objective as they define it, being securities that have revenues, essentially energy generating companies with a majority of revenue coming from renewable sources, meaning that these are energy producing companies, but they are focused on renewable energy, that forms the majority of their portfolio in terms of what do they use to generate power. Which raises the question of why does this fund have such a high emission profile? And again, we find that this fund again has exposures to securities that have predominant investments in fossil fuels. In some cases, these include exposures to coal. In the bottom right, we show the energy mix from the website of one of the companies that this fund invests in, which you reach after scrolling through a lot of advertising for greenness, essentially, in a very broad sense. So we see as of 2022 that this security is about 70% fossil fuels, but more than that, we see about 20% of it is in burning coal. So again, that would align with what we're seeing. This would explain the very high emission profile of this particular security. So when we go to assessing greenwashing, when we're looking at these outliers, when we're trying to use this information in a wholesale way, we very quickly identify concerns. It's not the case that we have explicit rules that we apply to all funds. These are largely set by the funds themselves in terms of how do they interpret SFDR, how do they report their alignment to it. But especially with the climate we're in, there is an important need to be able to assess this information, to be able to identify what they're stating, and then to be able to make the argument to them whether this is appropriate for their portfolio. So with that, I'll pass back to Gavin, who will speak to some of the supervisory implications for this work. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Brendan. And just to wrap up, I suppose we've been on this journey to be thank you. We've been on this journey to be data-driven supervisors, like many of the other speakers here today. And what the work that Brendan and the team have been able to do is provide our supervisors with a screen interface like this one in order to do their work. And what you're seeing here a little bit, if I even just momentarily hone in on the red in the middle where you see percentage 27, what you're seeing there, for example, is a claim that's being made. So a token, as Brendan describes it, a unit of information that our supervisors can use to assess relative to a benchmark, relative to a specific theme or direction, whether or not a particular fund, and this is an Article 9 fund making specific claims, whether or not the fund is actually doing what it says on the tin, as we'd say. And you can see very quickly as a supervisor, no matter how little time you have, that there's some anomalies here for this fund in terms of what it's claiming to do versus what it's actually doing. And this is exactly the example, or an example we feel, of what data-driven supervision can look like. Because on the right-hand side, you get a more broad breakdown here of the overall profile in terms of the investment in different emissions. That's useful. But even just if you think the schematic, the color, the supervisor of this firm and this fund is able immediately to have something at their fingertips that points them in a direction and allows them to engage with the firm and ask specific questions. It's an extremely, extremely powerful tool. What you see at the bottom is a little bit some nice work by Brendan as well, in that we're able to see the profile transition over time. So actually, On the first set of bars, you're seeing the current emissions profile, and we can see that over time, given the current investments for this fund, we do indeed expect that the emissions profile will become better. So it will go from 50% non-compliant to 27%. So over time, that will actually work, but we're not there yet. And as Brendan has been alluding to, with the existing regulations that are in play, what do we do about it? We can ask questions for sure, but where are we really when it comes to supervisory actions? So what we've shown you today is an approach that we think is very effective for us as supervisors in all sorts of different ways, whether that's around just exploration, whether it's very specifically to identify greenwashing, through the thematic reviews that we implement, through our general supervisory engagements, supervisory actions, and our enforcement actions. We should also mention that through this process, we have worked hand in glove business with our data analytics expertise and including our enforcement areas. So we've wanted to make sure that we've developed this in a way that means that when we do get down to a finding, that the type of information that we have will hold up if we do engage with an enforcement action in the future. I think that's very important. We've tried to catch that early. So then finally, just to wrap it up, we have seen a massive growth in ESG more generally. It does present enormous challenges for us from a supervisory perspective, but we feel with a tool like this and using analytics in the way that we have done, from the initial findings at the very least, that this is going to be a very powerful way for us to actually embed in our processes data-driven supervision. Thank you very much.